In a random duty roulette, you can meet a lot of odd and weird players, and most of them are perfectly fine and manageable, and are, for the most part, trying their best to make the run as quick and fun for everyone as possible. However, there are some that apparently wake up in the morning and choose violence. And I just want to talk a bit about some of the worst ones among them. And also highlight some of the reasons why they can be problematic, because if I didn't know better, they'd think they're helping the group with their behavior. Let's start with the classic, the Ninjapuller. Now, there's a huge difference between that and accidentally pulling an extra pack, or once in a blue moon pulling the next pack over due to habits. As most of us know, most dungeons we simply pull everything until the game tells us to stop, so if the tank decides to pull in an unusual way, sometimes muscle memory can make you used to continuing forward, which then makes you appear as a Ninjapuller. No, the problematic Ninjapullers are those players that either repeatedly do this, or for some reason, always have to be the first person landing the hit on the enemies. Listen, if you want the tank to go faster, you can always try and ask them with human words if they maybe could pull more. Naturally, sometimes the tank flat out refuses, and that is a topic in its own right, which I will get back to. However, as a DPS, or even as a healer, getting the first hit in on a pack of enemies, or even a boss, will cause the enemies to rush for you first instead of the tank. And while yes, it usually takes the tank just one strike to fix it, due to the awkwardly slow reaction time of mobs, they can easily spread all over the room before they remember the tank even exists. This also means that the tank's job becomes harder, and there is a reasonable chance the tank was pulling less because they already found it hard enough, so you are not helping. On top of that, now that the mobs are all over the place, guess who's doing less AoE damage? Everyone! Meaning that the fact that you just had to sneak in and attack before the tank actually circles back around and becomes a damage loss for you, rather than a gain. If nothing else, consider at least that. And even if it is a gain for just you somehow, remember that a dungeon run is a group effort, and the best you can do is play in such a way that allows everyone to do their best. That also tends to make the run go a bit faster, because you instead save time by not arguing or dying. Now, with those out of the way, I'm sure there are some tanks sniggering in the audience. Well, next up is the notorious player type that lives by the acronym YPYT. You pull, you tank. Now, you might think it has an acronym because it's popular, but it is equally possible it has such an acronym because it is so problematic. Just to be absolutely clear, the YPYT tank can be considered the inverse of a Ninjapuller. If you pull something before the tank does, or even if the tank just thinks you did, then the tank might actively go out of their way to not pick up the mob again, as some sort of punishment or something. This can even happen in situations where the ninja pull was by accident, because it is not uncommon for these YPYT tanks to punish the first offense without warning and simply use YPYT as the reasoning when you then end up dying. Now, I'm not saying that the tank just has to deal with it whenever some other party member decides to repeatedly ninja pull and mess up the group. There's a reason why I mentioned Ninjapullers first. However, I also mentioned that one of the primary causes of accidental ninja pulling is if the tank starts pulling in an unexpected way, meaning less than usual. And often this mistake can be entirely avoided if the group communicates. If the tank just says they would like to pull less, then a lot of players will be more likely to be willing to negotiate on that front. However, the YPYT problem tends to arise from tanks who believe that it is their choice and only their choice what gets pulled and what isn't getting pulled. That if you queue as tank, you're the only person who has a vote in the decision of how much is getting pulled. And by extension, how intense and at what pace the dungeon is going to go. Last I checked, that is actually not in the tank role description. Sure, tanks are the best suited for pulling the mobs, as their job is to keep the attention of the enemies and survive it as best they can, and to some degree even position the mobs effectively so everyone can maximize their damage. But decide dungeon pace is not on the list and probably shouldn't be either. As dungeon runs are a group effort, it is only fair if the pace of the dungeon run is always a group decision, which means that if someone wants something out of the ordinary, which does happen to be pulling less rather than more, then it is probably better to say so rather than just attempt to force everyone else into it. Naturally, a lot of players are willing to simply let the tank choose the pace, but that's not something you should expect to be the default, at least. What I'm saying is that just because you're the tank doesn't mean you get to choose the pace of the dungeon, and if someone does in fact pull for you repeatedly, the better move is to use human words to ask them not to, and maybe request a slower run if that's what you want. Ninja pulling and messing up pulls that way can be considered inappropriate behavior, and thus can technically be reported if done excessively and with clear intent. However, a tank intentionally not tanking by way of YPYT is also considered inappropriate behavior. In other words, the right thing to do when someone is doing something inappropriate is to stick to what is right on your end and try to communicate. If they refuse to communicate, then you at least are in your right position to report them after the dungeon. Repeated offenses that get reported accumulate, so players that repeatedly do these inappropriate things can end up in trouble. However, if you as a tank instead choose to employ YPYT, then you are equally in the wrong, and thus it no longer makes any sense to use the report system at all. Another perspective to consider to YPYT is that this causes a lot more drama than attempting to communicate with the potential ninja puller. And communicating also lets you learn whether it was intentional or not before you mete out vigilante justice. Not to mention, given that the rest of the party probably just wants to survive and clear the dungeon with as few bumps as possible, choosing not to pick up the mobs means that the responsibility instead falls on the healer, since now they have to heal a DPS who's tanking as well, which is even further emphasized in dungeons where the enemies aren't actually strong enough to beat a DPS. I know I'm kind of repeating the same thing over and over again, but the core problem is that YPYT is comparable to things like Tank God Complex, because the reasoning behind it is somewhat the same.
I am the tank. I choose what mobs we fight, and no one else will. You shall heed my command and follow my lead. And I choose to go slow today, so deal with it.
What if the healer stops healing you because they can't be bothered if there's very few mobs to fight? What if the DPS doesn't bother attacking because there aren't enough mobs to warrant their attention in their opinion? The YPYT argument is simply that because you didn't deem it time yet to pull those mobs, you refuse to change your plan. Technically, the healer and the DPS can reason the reverse and simply wait with acting until you have pulled the quote-unquote correct amount. That's also not okay, but I wonder if that puts a more logical light to this problem. You don't get to use your role's primary purpose as a negotiation chip. That one should be on the house. This somewhat conveniently leads us to the last problem, with the final role, the similarly named Healer God Complex. As a healer, your primary job is to make sure that the group survives by healing to the best of your ability. Naturally, you can't save everyone from everything, but you can certainly try your best. With any time you have to spare, you can attack, to help the fight get finished sooner. On that objective list, I don't see running in circles or dancing or anything else. If you have time to dance, you have time to attack. That should be reasonable to expect. Now, the Healer God Complex includes a few different things, but tends to be visible especially in 3 representations. The first one is the healer that doesn't want to attack. Their job is to heal, and they don't want your opinion on that. They will dance if it so pleases them, you will not argue, for they are your god. If they deem you unworthy, they can simply cause you to die by not healing you. I'm hoping you realize the absurdity of that statement. Not all so-called cure-bot healers are like this. Some of them choose to only heal because of uncertainty in the role, and they might still be learning. But at some point, that should stop being the reason. But if you decide that you are in fact a god, and so others' opinions are beneath you, it is quite easy to reach endgame sticking to this opinion. The second representation is a great friend of YPYT. The healer that chooses to not heal someone because they don't do as the healer wants. This can include a DPS ninja pulling, or a DPS not playing well enough, or a DPS getting hit by too many mechanics, and so the healer just can't be bothered to heal them more, even though they were perfectly capable of doing so. The third representation is actually also weirdly comparable to YPYT. The healer that demands that pulls are done one pack at a time, for example, or are pulled in the exact way that the healer wants it, otherwise they will not heal because they don't want to work so hard or whatever other reason they come up with. Now, you might realize this is an excellent callback to the argument that if YPYT is a reasonable way to decide how much is being pulled, then the healer's just as much in their right to choose when they deem you worthy to be healed. You might be able to see how these problems can clash, and yes, in case you were wondering, choosing intentionally to not heal someone when you could can technically be considered inappropriate behavior in the same way as YPYT is. Lethargic behavior. Essentially, you are intentionally being lazy. And just to be clear, when I point out that healers refusing to attack is a problem, that doesn't mean that healers that hardly heal at all, choosing instead to only attack, are not a problem. If I'm doing a dungeon, I would always rather have a healer that only heals than one that only attacks, because at least the Cure Mage is going to keep us alive to finish the duty, but the Glare Mage puts that responsibility on everyone else, which isn't always possible. In extension of these examples of bad actors, one major problem with all of them is that what they do can often be by accident. So you can never be sure if they're actually intentionally acting in this way without confronting them. Even if they do it repeatedly, they might not actually realize it if they're not outright saying so. That healer might be rusty because they haven't played the role in a while. That tank might genuinely not have noticed that someone pulled more. And the DPS might genuinely think that the tank is right behind them and only realizes several seconds later that in fact they are not. This is why I'm highlighting these bad behaviors, to maybe shine a light that randomly some of those people using these tactics might realize that they are not actually helping by acting like this. When YPYT is used, everyone else has to work harder because the tank decided to mentally dip. When the healer's not participating properly, whether it is by not healing or not attacking, it means everyone else has to work harder, either to survive or to pick up the slack. As the healer actually has the capacity to do a lot of damage, especially on AoE. And when a DPS is pulling for someone else, it is just really annoying. And I say all this as a tank main who plays healer secondarily and DPS tertiarily. I, as a tank, say that I would rather pull more to satisfy the Ninjapuller than deal with the aftermath of not doing so. So, do you know some other common examples of bad actors in a duty roulette? It doesn't have to be a dungeon thing specifically, but putting it into words might make some of these people realize that they're not always the hero in these stories, certainly. To the rest of y'all, just remember, it's just a game. Make the most of it. Someone pulling weird or healing weird, try and challenge yourself. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, due to tanks having an inherent 20% less damage done than other jobs, and casters in general having the trait Maim and Mend, 100 healer potency tends to be comparable to over 150 tank potency. This is of course balanced by healers having hardly any burst at all, but should at least be a factor in considering the value of your attacks as a healer during large AoE pulls.